Good morning, everyone, and very warm welcome to Massey College this morning. Just a reminder that there is breakfast going to be served in the upper library, which is adjacent to this room, and very warm welcome to those of you joining us online. We will begin in approximately 10 minutes, so please take this time to use the washroom or get some coffee. Thanks so much, and we look forward to beginning very soon. Good morning, everyone. Just a reminder, we'll be beginning in 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Thanks so much. Good morning, and very warm welcome today to those of you in the room and joining us online for this year's Walter Gordon Symposium. My name is Arvind Krishendahal, and I'm a junior fellow here at Massey College and a PhD student studying public policy and Canadian politics. And I'm also a very proud member of today's organizing committee. I welcome you today by beginning with an acknowledgement of the traditional land on which we are situated. We not only do so as a measure of standard routine here at the college, but as a powerful reminder of the responsibilities tied to this land and to the importance of grounding our conversations in reflection, respect, and accountability. We wish to acknowledge that this land on which the University of Toronto operates, for thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. In situating our discussion today, we keep in mind the ongoing work that needs to be done to advance reconciliation. When selecting the thematic focus of this year's Walter Gordon Symposium, we face no easy task in selecting among the many urgent issues shaping contemporary public life. From the rise of artificial intelligence to public uncertainty abroad, there was no shortage of possible directions for us to go in. And yet, in the midst of these wide-ranging discussions, we returned repeatedly to one issue whose effects are immediate, deeply felt, and impossible to ignore: Canada's affordability crisis. The title of today's conference, Rethinking Canada's Affordability Crisis, Cross-Sectoral Perspectives, Challenges and Solutions, reflects exactly that concern. It speaks not only to the urgency of the issue before us, but also to the need to examine it through multiple lenses, to challenge some of our underlying assumptions and biases, and to think more critically, collaboratively, and creatively about the kinds of responses this moment demands. We chose this theme because affordability is not a narrow economic concern, nor is it simply a question of inflation, budgets, or consumer confidence. It is now a broad and defining social issue, one that shapes whether people can secure stable housing, afford nutritious food, access timely healthcare, and most significantly, live with a basic sense of dignity and security. What makes this crisis especially pressing is that it does not unfold in only one area of life. It is cross-sectoral, it is layered, and it is cumulative. That is why today we're focusing on three interconnected domains: housing, food security, and healthcare. First, on housing. Housing is perhaps one of the clearest and most visible expressions of the affordability crisis. Across the country, too many individuals and families are finding that safe, stable, and appropriate housing is increasingly out of reach. Rising rents, high home prices, limited affordability housing have made it difficult not only to find these spaces, but to remain securely housed. But housing is never only about physical shelter. It is about stability, belonging, mental health, and participation in community life. When housing becomes unaffordable, the consequences ripple outward. People are pushed farther from work, schools, and support networks. Young people delay independence. Families lived in overcrowded conditions. Second, on food security. Food insecurity reveals another painful dimension of the affordability crisis. Even where food is physically available, it is increasingly unaffordable for many people. The rising cost of groceries has transformed an essential human need into a source of persistent stress and anxiety. Once again, food insecurity is a central tenet. It is about health, childhood development, culture, and social inclusion. It is about whether families can gather around a meal, whether children can focus in school, and the well-being needed to participate fully in society. Third, on healthcare. Healthcare is often discussed as a system of public provision, but affordability remains central here too. Even in a publicly funded system, the costs people face are real, from prescription drugs to mental health services to unpaid caregiving and lost wages while waiting for care. For many, the affordability crisis is also a healthcare crisis. Delays in accessing care can worsen underlying conditions. The inability to pay for medication or treatment can turn manageable health issues into emergencies. And when people cannot access preventative or community-based care, pressure intensifies elsewhere in the system. The result is not only personal hardship, but broader systemic strain. Today is not only an opportunity to diagnose a crisis, it is an opportunity to think collectively across sectors and disciplines about what meaningful responses might look like. We wanted to ensure that the conversation today remained grounded not only in broad policy discussions, but also in the lived and living realities of individuals and communities on the ground. On each panel today, you'll see representation from academics, government, and civil society leaders, reflecting our strong belief that responding to Canada's affordability crisis demands dialogue across institutions, sectors, and lived experience. Bringing these perspectives together is essential if we are serious about moving beyond direction and toward action. Our hope is that this symposium creates space not only to identify the scale of the problem, but also to think seriously about solutions. Solutions that are practical, equitable, and attentive to the realities of those most affected. Following the panel today, we will engage in a policy co-design session that will allow us to take the learnings and discussions from the morning and early afternoon and begin translating them into concrete ideas, shared priorities, and actionable next steps. It is very seldom that we have the opportunity to bring together individuals from across sectors, communities, and areas of expertise in one shared space. We hope to make the most of that opportunity by fostering thoughtful dialogue, honest reflection, and most importantly, collaborative problem solving. Finally, I want to note that the discussions and findings from today's event will help inform a report that will capture the key insights, themes, and recommendations emerging from this symposium. The report will be circulated to participants and published on the Massey website with the goal of extending the conversation beyond today's gathering and supporting continued dialogue and collaboration. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas Axworthy, Chair of the Public Policy Program, for continued opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Arvind, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Massey College. Delighted you are joining us, and a shout out to my old friend Gerard Kennedy, former Minister of Education and my Member of Parliament from Hyde Park, who is joining us today. So he's representative of the kinds of people who come to join us here at Massey College for these colloques. I want, Arvind's already outlined the framework for today's very important discussion around affordability. I wanted just to speak a moment about the name of this symposium is the Walter Gordon Symposium, and I wanted to spend a word or two on the history of Mr. Gordon because his career has bearing today on how we approach the issues that are facing Canada in our time as he faced them in his in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So Walter Gordon was an important businessman, set up Clarkson Gordon and Woods Gordon, major business interests. But very early as a young man, as he was working with Canadian industry, began to get worried about American ownership. He saw more and more Canadian companies begin, start up, develop a bearing, and then be taken over. And he began to worry very early, perhaps really the first notable figure in Canada who began to worry about the Americanization of the Canadian economy and what that would mean for our future independence. And we now know today those fears were not groundless. But in order to deal with that problem and others, he put a lot of resources into Massey College because he believed in public debates. He set up the public policy program at Massey in the 1970s, which I have the honor to chair today, and with the belief that as today, with our discussions both within the college and online, that the best way to approach issues was to have contending points of view and to raise them in the public. So he was a tremendous believer in engagement and debate. And that reflects the mission of Massey College. He was also someone who believed in skilled policy responses with our partner today in the Monk School of Public Policy. Gordon chaired 2 royal commissions where he brought the best of expertise one was on the public service, the other on the economy, to bring to bear so that government would have expert views from the outside, not just governed by the internal demands of politics and the public service. So a long time ago, he was an exemplar of trying to bring policy skills and training to bear on current issues. And that certainly is a strong tradition that infuses our students at Monk School and Massey, who have been working together since last fall on this conference to decide what subjects should be, to attract the speakers, to do all of the groundwork. Because one of the ideas that Mr. Gordon had was that young people should have a voice and an engagement. And so as part of his legacy to Massey College, he put together an endowment that there would be a student-run policy conference every year. Whatever else Massey was doing on whatever topics, there would be at least one time in the year where students would learn to organize symposium and bring their values and their concerns to bear in the agenda of Massey and Monk. And so we are the beneficiaries today, and the excellent student committees that Carolyn and I have worked on with them over the past year on that vision that Mr. Gordon had. I should also just add, parenthetically, I'm delighted to work on the Walter Gordon Symposium because he was also wise enough to give me my first job and bring me to Ottawa as a researcher and a speechwriter. But there's also a little lesson there for particularly our more youthful colleagues who are thinking of their first jobs. The first speech that I wrote for Mr. Gordon was calling for a bombing halt in the Vietnam War. He was in the cabinet of Mr. Pearson, and it was a very successful speech, had huge, enormous public response, but Mr. Pearson said that slightly unhappy with my effort that Gordon could stay in the cabinet on the condition he not give a speech again. So I managed to write myself out of a job on my very first effort. But there were lots of lessons contained there too. So today we meet full of challenges. World trading system thrown to the wolves by the trade policy of the United States. We meet as a war is going on, affecting supply chains across the world. The international system, as we know it, is showing tremendous strains. That has domestic implications on the possible rise of interest rates, puts enormous pressures on the social net. Our government's federal government here in Ontario, it's $14 billion deficit. The federal deficit about $80 billion. We go across every province, Manitoba, $1.6 billion. That is, when the economy slows, of course, you have, for many other issues, but you have fewer resources to try to spend on the social dimension. And it puts tremendous pressures around inflation, potentially rising with energy prices. And inflation is in many ways the real killer on affordability, on food prices, on housing, and on health. And so inflation is a silent killer of people's dreams. And so our students are organizing today a colloque to bring us to understand this issue better, to perhaps have some solutions. So when we think of this very difficult time to meet with the structures and the systems that we have known for our lives showing tremendous stress, I think of the line of that Leonard Cohen wrote in his song, I think it was Anthem, 92 or 93. And Cohen wrote, "There are cracks everywhere, but don't despair, that's how the light gets in." What I hope today is that we not only look at the cracks in our system, but the light of learning and expertise will shine in and out to inform the Canadian public. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom, for those remarks. I'll now like to welcome Dr. Carolyn Toohey, Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Senior Fellow here at both Massey College and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Carolyn, welcome.
Thanks so much. Excuse me. Thanks so much, Arvin, and thanks, Tom, for those opening remarks. I do love that line from Leonard Cohen, and it applies in many dimensions of life, I find. It is a great pleasure for me to be here to bring welcome from, excuse me, from the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I am, as Arvin noted, I have the honor of being a fellow at both at Massey and at Munk, as does my colleague Tom. I did not have a personal connection to Walter Gordon, sadly, but I was present at the creation of this particular partnership. Although the public policy program at Massey, as Tom mentioned, dates from the 1970s and from the generosity and vision of Walter Gordon, it was in 2009 that, and fittingly for a student-led initiative, and we emphasize this is a student-led initiative, fittingly it was a student in the first MPP class, Master of Public Policy class, at what was then the School of Public Policy and Governance, who was also a junior fellow at Massey, and she had the insight to see that this was an initiative that Munk and Massey were natural partners in. And so since 2009, it's been co-sponsored by both places. Which are, I must say, personally dearest to my academic heart, if one can have an academic heart, and my intellectual world at the University of Toronto. It's entirely appropriate that it is Massey and Munk students who are bringing us together today. In my experience, students in the, Munk students in the MPP and MGA bring to their studies, their practice, a level of passion and creativity and commitment that is the highest I have experienced in my teaching career. It is a joy to teach Munk students. And junior fellows, for their part, are the greatest concentration of sheer intellectual curiosity, voracious curiosity, anywhere on campus. So it's a delight to see this partnership that brings the two together, and as there are many overlaps, as the founder of this partnership represented. The Symposium today is an example of the commitment and passion and intellect that these students do, these junior colleagues do, to the issues that Tom has so graphically laid out for us. And as Arvind noted, it is entirely appropriate that this forum bring together representatives of the three sectors that constitute a liberal democracy, a liberal political order: the academy, government, and civil society. And every panel will have voices from each of those sectors. The issue that we're addressing, affordability, is one, as Tom has laid out, is one that is galvanizing attention, not only in Canada, but elsewhere, and threatens the foundation of hope that is the bedrock of a liberal democracy. The belief that things will get better, that one can improve one's circumstances, is fundamental to a liberal democracy. It's fundamental to the kinds of compromises that are necessary in a liberal democracy. You may not get everything you want at a given point in time, but you can hope that over time, on balance, everything will get better, not only for you, but for society as a whole. That is fundamentally threatened by the affordability crisis. So I very much look forward to what we are going to hear today. I expect to learn a lot, and I congratulate the organizers on pulling together this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. With that, we would like to begin our first panel. Introducing our first panel is Asha, a junior fellow here at Massey College. Welcome, Asha.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Asha Moody, and I'm a Master of Architecture student at the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design, and as Arvind mentioned, a junior fellow here at Massey College. Before I begin the introductions, I'll just ask that the first panel please be seated. James, our moderator, Carolyn, and Dylan. So today's panel brings together perspectives from research, policy, and frontline leadership to think through one of the most urgent issues facing us today, affordability and housing. And so we're really fortunate to have a group of panelists whose work spans both analysis and action. So without further ado, I'll briefly introduce our panel today. First, Dr. Carolyn Weitzman, who's a housing and social policy researcher. She's an adjunct professor and senior housing researcher at the University of Toronto's School of Cities, undertaking research on scaling up affordable and non-market housing supply. She has worked as an expert advisor to UBC's Housing Assessment Research Tools project, which developed standardized best practices for analyzing housing need using government land for non-market housing and non-market property acquisition, all of which has influenced federal policy. Carolyn is the author, co-author, or lead editor of 6 books, including Home Truths, Fixing Canada's Housing Crisis from 2024, and Clara at the Door with a Revolver, The Scandalous Black Suspect and the Exemplary White Stun and the Murder That Shocked Toronto from 2023. She has provided expertise to national, state, provincial, and local governments, UN Women, UN Habitat, and private and nonprofit organizations. Next to Carolyn, we have Dylan Morando. Dylan is a Canadian political scientist and healthcare executive specializing in tax policy, fiscal policy, the care economy, technology adoption, and governance. He has held positions of Deputy Director of Policy to the Prime Minister of Canada, Principal Advisor to the President of the Treasury Board of Canada, Executive Director, National Housing Strategy to Canada's Minister of Housing, Senior Advisor, Policy to the Premier of Ontario, and Canadian Head of Strategy and Government Affairs for Simons Healthcare. Dylan has served on the boards of directors of Canadian Science Publishing, Myeloma Canada, Geist Magazine, and the Burlington Symphony Orchestra, as well as the C.D. Howe Health Policy Council. Dylan studied at the University of Toronto, where he received Honors Bachelor of Art, a Master of Public Policy, and a doctorate in political science, and where he has taught as a sessional lecturer at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Dylan is also a recipient of the King Charles III Coronation Medal. And joining us shortly will be Christy Upshaw. Christy is the Chief Executive Officer of Our Place Peel, where she has led since 2016, having been with the agency since 1998. I'll restart. Christy's here. Thank you for coming. Okay, so Christy Upshaw, she is the Chief Executive Officer of Our Place Peel, where she has led the organization since 2016. She has been with the agency since 1998. She brings more than 25 years of experience spanning frontline work, management, and executive leadership. Christy oversees the organization's strategic direction, operations, and program development, ensuring youth experiencing homelessness in Peel region have access to essential supports and opportunities. Her deep understanding of the sector is grounded in decades of direct service and leadership within one of the region's most critical youth-serving organizations. In addition to her role as CEO, Christy serves as board chair at St. Leonard's Place Peel and is the co-chair of the Peel Alliance to End Homelessness. She is actively engaged in policy advocacy within the homelessness sector and serves on the leadership team for the Metamorphosis Network, a coalition of over 100 nonprofit organizations in Peel working collaboratively to strengthen community services and advocate for equitable funding and systems change. Christy is a passionate advocate for strengthening community-based responses to homelessness and advancing systems that empower young people to build stable, positive futures. And moderating our housing panel today is James Lawtons. James is a first-year Master of Public Policy student at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He graduated with an Honors Bachelor of Art with high distinction from Victoria College at the University of Toronto, where he studied history and classical civilization. Previously, he has worked as an archival assistant at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., and as an engagement coordinator and junior research fellow at the NATO Association of Canada. Currently, he does contract work for the Critical Minerals Institute based here in Toronto. His research interests include the intersection of global security and culture, as well as how to destigmatize social housing. Thank you all for being here today, and James, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Asha. That was excellent. Thank you. Thank you. First, thank you all so much to our panelists for coming here on behalf of Massey College. This looks to be an excellent panel, and I'm really excited to moderate it. So we will dive immediately into a question that I think is incredibly timely, which is, with the current energy crisis and new rumors in the news of maybe not going into the office to preserve fuel, and looking at as well the back to work orders that various governments, specifically here in Ontario as well, has issued back to get full return to the office, I just wanted to ask, what do you think are the biggest barriers to adaptive reuse of buildings for housing right now, especially within the downtown core? Dr. Miranda, if I may start with you.
No.
I like to keep you on your toes.
Yeah, I did not expect that as a first question. I will say that with respect to adaptive reuse specifically, I think a lot of progress has been made over the course of the last few years because of what, among other things, the federal government did with the Rapid Housing Initiative. So I think a certain set of norms has emerged around the need to repurpose commercial buildings and to accelerate repair and construction. I think there are a number of other measures that governments at other levels need to introduce to match some of the supply measures that have been driven by federal policy. Tax policy at the municipal and provincial level, I think, is an integral part of that. And I also think, although this speaks to a broader point, which I suspect we'll get to through the conversation, the financialization of the housing market is a dynamic which needs to be addressed by all three levels of government. It's driving housing prices and supply and demand dynamics just as much as the construction of housing is. So immediately, those are the three things that jump to mind for me. I think there are opportunities that are created because of some of the technological advancements that are happening in the construction industry. So as, again, a broader point, I think we need to make sure that our housing policy matches the realities of technological acceleration and the willingness of developers and home builders and those who work in the construction industry to adopt those technologies. But I'm optimistic for, on a whole range of fronts on housing, but this is actually one area where I'm also optimistic.
Okay, that's very interesting, the financialization of housing. I want to ask Ms. Upshaw if you could comment a little bit on that, because at least in my conception of housing and the issues we're seeing, especially with affordability and with the unhoused not being able to find a place for themselves, do you see that financialization as driving that crisis, that issue?
So first of all, sorry I'm late, and I have some notes here as well, so I'm not as polished as these two folks. But I think, you know, I'm from Peel, and the biggest issue right now that we have is we have a 30,000 person wait list for affordable housing, which equals about 22 years. So you can imagine people are not moving through the system very quickly. I think a lot of the builders, there is incentives to build housing, but it's not for our folks that need it. We need affordable, deeply affordable housing. We need the nonprofit sector to be involved with the builders to be able to build sustainable funding or housing for the folks. I think that there is opportunity to segregate or stagger some of the affordable housing within the communities to better meet the needs of the folks that are required housing. Sorry.
Oh no, it's all good. Directly, no, I was Joe was telling me earlier directly into the mic. No, it's all good. And Dr. Weitzman, if I may ask your thoughts on the matter.
Which question? They were two very different questions. So to start off with conversion of office and commercial space into housing, I would say that a lot of people are clutching on gimmicks right now. That's one of the gimmicks. It is possible to convert some office buildings into housing. They generally have large floor plates that aren't really suitable for, like the bathrooms are in the core, et cetera. There was a really interesting conversion in Calgary of a former oil company's building into 4 floors of supportive housing and I think 6 floors of other social housing above it. So it's possible. But I'm sorry, I'm just going to start with some framing.
Please do.
Okay. So the National Housing Strategy was Canada's first affordable housing strategy since it stepped out of housing in the the late 80s, but formally in about 1992. And that means, as Christy was saying, at least 3 decades, I'd argue under the National Housing Strategy, a continued neglect of the genuinely low-cost housing that 80% of households in housing need. So officially, our number is 1.7 million households who are in unaffordable, poorly repaired, and or overcrowded housing. That doesn't include students. Students aren't included in housing need, even though there's about 2.2 million students in Canada, post-secondary. It doesn't include homeless people. It doesn't include people in collective housing. So in a report I did in 2023 for the Housing Advocate, I counted all those uncounted households and came up with a housing need of 4.4 million households, and about 80%, about 4 in 5, are low-income households who can afford no more than $1,000 a month. And any of you who live in Toronto know how difficult it is to imagine a studio, well, a room, a studio, one-bedroom apartment, let alone a home for, say, a single mom with 1 or 2 kids who's reliant on minimum wage, and if you get minimum wage, that's about $1,000 a month. The good news, and like Dylan, I like to be an optimist, is that the National Housing Strategy needs to be renewed this year. The agreements around housing benefits end in early 2027. All of the federal affordable housing programs are out of money. So if we don't review the National Housing Strategy, well, first of all, it would be against the law under the National Housing Strategy Act, but we've had homelessness in Ontario increased by 50% in the last 4 years. It will continue to increase, and I would suggest increase exponentially if we don't do something fairly serious fairly soon. So while conversion of shopping malls or office buildings would be a very small part of answering the problem, the real question is who needs what housing, where, and at what cost, and that's something that we need to bring renewed effort to at all 3 levels of government, as Dylan suggests.
Excellent. Dylan, you want to respond?
Yeah, I'm going to do some framing as well, because
Please
I think
do.
that's helpful to situate all of our answers, including my own. And I'm going to build on Carolyn's comments earlier around the origins of the Walter Gordon Symposium and admit that in addition to being an instructor at the Monk School these days, I am an alumni of the Monk School, and I was at that first Walter Gordon Symposium in 2009. And so I'm going to channel some of my youthful optimism from those days and say that, and I'll also disclose a bias. I was the executive director of the National Housing Strategy when we built the National Housing Strategy. So I'm naturally going to say good things about it. But in 2009, if I were on this stage and we were talking about housing, and I told the room of you folks that we were going to recognize housing as a human right in a National Housing Strategy Act, I would have been laughed out of the room. If I told you that we were going to have a national portable housing benefit that was providing support to hundreds of thousands of Canadians who are at risk of homelessness or who are exiting homelessness, I would have been laughed out of the room. If I told you that the federal government was going to get back into the business of housing and provide operating support to hundreds of thousands of community housing units across the country and repair those units and build more units, I would have been laughed out of the room. So in my view, notwithstanding the faults of the National Housing Strategy, notwithstanding the fact that we have to learn from the last decade and build a better National Housing Strategy, which, to Carolyn's point, is now legally required thanks to the National Housing Strategy Act, I think the last decade of housing, particularly at the level of the federal government, but I would say also at certain provincial levels and municipal levels, was the most innovative decade for housing policy in 50 or 60 years. Again, the 90s and 2000s and first half of the 2010s dug a big hole for the community housing sector and for the market housing sector as well. And what we were trying to do through the National Housing Strategy, and I've only mentioned a fraction of the measures that were part of that strategy, was build a scaffolding that we could then use over many cycles of National Housing Strategy renewal to build a functioning housing system broadly defined, but particularly for the most vulnerable communities. Because the chief criticism of the National Housing Strategy, at least when I was on the other side of the table and was meeting with frustrated stakeholders, was that it didn't do enough to help aspiring first-time homeowners. And that's true. But I'm proud of the fact that given the resources we had at the time, we decided to focus those resources on those communities that were most vulnerable. We tripled our federal investments in homelessness. As I said, we got back into the business of supporting community housing operating agreements. We did repair, we did supply, and very importantly, we looked at demand. And that's perhaps a second reason for being optimistic. The fact that there's a growing consensus, not just in the housing sector among policymakers or policy leaders, but there's a growing consensus across the economic policy community that we have to think about demand. Supply is the word that government leaders use a lot, and I appreciate why they need to do that. But if wages don't increase, if we don't achieve economic growth, if we're not doing more to reinforce our income security programs, then we will continue to have a housing affordability challenge in this country. And I think Canadians are reckoning with this fact right now. I think Canadians are recognizing that over the last decade and beyond, corporate profits, particularly within the corner of the economy that is represented by big business and big businesses that have the least competition, and we have a competition problem across our economy, profits are rising at a rate that is not equal to the growth in wages. And this I think is a newer narrative. It's not quite as old as our frustrations and our policy building on the housing side, but over the last couple of years, there's a recognition of this. And I think if and as governments of all levels crack down on the profiteering that we're seeing and ensure that workers are getting their fair share of wages, and ensure, by the way, that small businesses are not also being gouged by some of these bigger businesses, then that is going to take a big bite, a big and positive bite out of the affordability crisis. But both those things are happening at different paces, and they have different starting points. But it makes me hopeful that policy leaders and civil society are starting to look at the right issues, they're starting to ask the right questions, and they're beginning to develop some of the solutions that we need to chase.
Very good. Oh,
if I can just follow up on a couple
of course, please.
things that Dylan said. I mean, in order to tie it into the overall theme of the day, for many women in particular, there's a choice between paying the rent and feeding the kids. So if you're paying 50 or 70% of your income on rent or on mortgage, I suppose, but it's far more common amongst tenants. If you are amongst the 3% of tenants who are evicted every year without being able to find a new place to live, you're faced with some really stark choices about both food and healthcare. And this isn't a new problem. As Dylan says, in 2002, I was doing workshops in a number of places, Kingston, Huntsville, I think, downtown Toronto, and Oshawa. And in Oshawa, I spoke to a woman at a community health center who walked 5 kilometers to and from the community health center because she couldn't afford any other form of transit. And the irony was that she was walking to the community health center in order to get help with her back, which was out. So she walked 5 kilometers with a bad back because her presenting problem, the main problem that she had, was she found it impossible to find a home anywhere else. So I tend to subscribe to the housing theory of everything. If we were able to fix the housing problem, we'd be dealing with a lot of the food problems, definitely the healthcare problems. I mean, if you're a woman without a home, you have a life expectancy half that of a woman with a home. So, you know, housing is the biggest health determinant. I just want to talk briefly about income because it is really important. And the Massey Foundation just published a report saying that social assistance is an express train to homelessness. You cannot find a room in most of Ontario with the amount that you get for Ontario Works or Ontario people with ODSP. So that's a problem. But even if you had a miraculous answer like the COVID era social supports, CERB in particular, that single-handedly lifted 250,000 households out of housing need by bringing them to $2,000 a month instead of maybe $800 a month. But if you had $2,000 a month, you'd still need to find a place for $800 a month, and that is impossible in the Greater Toronto area. So even if, absolutely, provinces are the biggest contributor to homelessness right now. Absolutely, the National Housing Strategy needs to talk about adequate social assistance, adequate minimum wage, not evictions into homelessness, adequate health and social supports. But even if the province did all of those things, we'd still need more non-market affordable housing.
Excellent. I would like to pass that actually to you, Ms. Upshaw. You're seeing people often receiving these benefits, often receiving them. And I'm just curious as to the impact of receiving these, and does it actually help? I mean, does it actually help? Does it help to give access to these resources, or are there other barriers that, say, governments may neglect?
So I think, just from my lens, working in the homeless youth sector in the region of Peel, we have 100 emergency shelter beds, and we have 17 transitional beds. And the 17 transitional beds, youth can stay there for 18 months. They can live there semi-independently. They are working towards independence. They pay rent geared to their income. The region of Peel subsidizes some of the rent. And they have successfully moved on to independent living or going back home to see their families, pursuing their education, employment, etc. However, the 100 youth that are in our shelter system right now, and we're usually at a 100% occupancy, don't have those life skills right now. They have, unfortunately, many of them have come out of the child welfare system. They're involved in, they have some mental health and addictions issues, and they can't afford rent rates. The region of Peel, as I mentioned, does provide some subsidies. And we do see folks moving in onto their own, but they need the support around them. So a lot of our staff will go into the community, and our goal is to mediate with landlords and to keep these young people housed. We'd rather them housed than living in the shelter. And then we have on top of that the youth unemployment rate as it continues to climb. So although youth can, some of these programs are effective for the young people, it's very young, being 16 to 24, to live on their own. They feel very isolated, and trying to navigate those systems is very difficult for them. But I do see a lot of the region of the subsidies that are coming through to support the young folks to be able to live on their own, but it's not sustainable. And as I mentioned, we're talking about affordable, and then we're talking about deeply affordable. These aren't first-time home buyers. These young kids aren't going to look for a home. They just need a place to live. So.
And it's interesting to hear all these mechanisms, all these, in my mind, so like social housing mechanisms. And what I'm interested in as a researcher, what I'm slowly moving towards, is understanding how to destigmatize it, how to make it. I want to say acceptable, because there's still, at least I find in some circles, this idea of, oh, social housing, isn't that not great? And so I guess my question would be, how can civil society organizations, how can governments, how can businesses, how can nonprofits and NGOs work towards that destigmatization? How can we make it so that people understand that this is just helping people who may be a little bit more down on their luck than usual, and that it is needed to help make a good member to society, a good contributing member? I would be curious. Dr.
Let
Woodsman?
me just jump in, James.
Yeah,
because
please.
I actually, when I live in Toronto, and I'm in Toronto about 1 week a month, I'm living in social housing. I'm living in a co-op. Social housing, non-market housing includes public housing. About 2/3 of social housing is public housing. About 15% are co-ops. About 20% are other forms of nonprofits, such as the one that Christy was talking about. There is a problem where the current population of, say, Toronto community housing, because more social housing hasn't been built, are the people who have the lowest incomes, and their incomes, even with housing benefits, is nowhere close to what is needed to help maintain homes that, in 50% of the cases, were built before 1980. So 50% of the non-market housing in Canada is more than 45 years old. Guess what? It needs repairs. If there's stigma.
I may ask if you could hold your mic a bit closer so
sure.
people at home can hear. Thank you.
If there's stigma, it's stigma in the absence of really good alternatives. I mean, I stay in St. Lawrence neighborhood. St. Lawrence neighborhood was built in the 1970s, over 50 years ago. It is 2/3 non-market housing. It is a very attractive community. People stay there a long time. Part of the reason that people stay there a long time is there's absolutely nowhere to move to. And part of the reason that people stay there a long time is it works as a community. And the third, that are condos, never have any problem selling because it's actually a wonderfully cohesive community. So to me, the problem isn't non-market housing or stigmatization of non-market housing or stigmatization of non-single family house alternatives, which still happens in Canada to my astonishment, but that's another whole other set of issues. It's the fact that in the 1970s and the 1980s, with federal help, an average of 14% of home completions were non-market housing. Then we went to 0. Then we went to 1% for about a decade. And then under the National Housing Strategy, 2 to 3% of completions are non-market housing. If we had 60% of non-market housing, as in the case of Vienna, or more realistically, move towards 20% of non-market housing, which is what has happened consistently over the last 26 years in France, you would have a greater variety of new buildings, some of which would be architect designed and look lovely or whatever, you know, and you would also have the ability to rent to a greater variety of people who desperately need housing. And I think a lot of that stigma would simply dissipate if there was more varieties of social housing. I mean, non-market housing wins architectural awards all the time in France. It wins architectural awards all the time in Australia. There's no reason why non-market housing can't be a delightful, wonderful addition to a community with, you know, adequate funding that focuses on the people who need housing the most.
Excellent. Dr. Miranda, would you like to jump in a little?
No, it's a great point. I completely agree. Mm-hmm. The more, if we build the right kinds of housing, then I don't think that stigma exists to the extent that it does exist. I will say parenthetically that I think most Canadians, most folks in this province, most folks in this city believe that we're in it together, and they recognize the value of investing in community housing, broadly defined, and they recognize the value of having each other's backs and making sure that we're supporting vulnerable communities. So I'm not sure how big that stigma is, frankly. I think there are some folks with very loud voices, NIMBYs, et cetera, who maybe don't want a project in their backyard. But I continue to believe that most folks, a very, very, very large silent majority, do want these kinds of investments, and that there's a social license across governments, across party lines, to build the kind of housing that Carolyn's talked about. So mixed use, mixed income, mixed market, and or housing projects that are purely non-market but built to the highest standards. That's what we need to be doing, and that will reduce stigma. But independent of reducing stigma, it makes more vibrant communities. It makes for more livable spaces, and that's why we should be doing it.
Excellent. Ms. Upshaw, please.
I completely agree. I think there is stigma for people that are experiencing housing instability, and I think that it's even layered with youth. Youth have a difficult time finding a place. Landlords do not want to rent to them. However, I do believe it's important that in order for the system to work together, that there is lived experience at the table, developing housing, supporting, talking about what their needs are. I think that will reduce the stigma as well as we're trying to build housing for everyone.
Excellent. And I would actually like to move on to something that I try to conceptualize, or at least I'm very biased. I was born and raised in this city. I look at affordability from a very urban perspective, and I understand, at least again in the circles that I frequent, it is very much a dominant perspective. But I'm curious, how can we define affordability for more rural environments? What is that? Is there necessarily a strong negative dichotomy of it's urban affordability versus rural affordability, or is there a intertwined element that hasn't been properly revealed yet? And if I may, Dr. Weitzman, pass that to you.
Sure. If you go to any meeting, let's say, of the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, which represents hundreds of municipalities, you'll hear from every single mayor, whether they're the mayor of Egansville, population 4,000, or the mayor of Toronto, population close to 3 million, you'll hear concerns about homelessness. Homelessness isn't just a big city issue anymore. There's homelessness everywhere. There is also increasing difficulty in renting or purchasing a home in areas like Muskoka. I mean, I say Muskoka because I was recently up there speaking to the Muskoka Community Land Trust, as people with either second homes or they're telecommuting push out anyone who wants to work or who works as a service worker. Even ironically, it's very hard for construction workers in a place like Muskoka, let alone a place like the Greater Toronto Area, to find an affordable place to live, even as they build the homes for other folks. So that's really problematic. There is a very simple and straightforward way to count housing need, and when I worked for the Housing Assessment Resource Tools Project, we did it. And if you go to the website, you will see housing need for every community in Canada, every province, every territory, but also every CD, like municipality. And that is looking at the area median household income, and then looking at the proportion of people who are at 20% of area median household income or very low income, at 50% or low income, et cetera. Of course, it's a different median income in Gander than it is from Victoria, but that doesn't mean that Gander doesn't have its problems right now.
Excellent. Dr. Miranda, do you have any additions?
Yeah, as we've said throughout the panel, I think it's important to recognize that these housing challenges and opportunities exist within an ecosystem of economic challenges and opportunities and policy processes. My macro view is that the future in Canada, the future in Ontario, is rural and northern and remote. I think we're in the fight of our lives. I think we can't win that fight unless we're fighting at full strength. And the truth is, and I'll be critical of a particular politician, we have a premier in this province, for example, who thinks he's the premier of Toronto, not the premier of Ontario. And the investments that are being made, or the attention that is being paid to communities outside of Toronto, is insufficient. And that includes investments in infrastructure, that includes investments in housing, and that includes investments in job creation. So I think we have a very big challenge in front of us with respect to economic development and growth in rural and northern communities, and communities in Western Ontario and Eastern Ontario, using this province as an example. And we haven't risen to that challenge yet. There are housing challenges, but there are also wage challenges, economic opportunity challenges, and I'm hoping that governments pay more attention to this as we move through the next year, 2, 3, and navigate the macroeconomic challenges that we're facing because of events south of the border.
Okay, excellent. Ms. Upshaw.
Yeah, I can just add in that what we're seeing a lot in the homelessness sector in the region of Peel is that folks want to stay connected within the region or Toronto. When you go rural, and I think it might be more expensive to build, I think there could be some more opportunity for newer builds. But but folks that need support need to be around systems like education, childcare, child welfare, any of those systems, and transit is a big piece. The region of Peel is overseen by Brampton, Mississauga, and Caledon, and the transit system in Caledon is completely different than the rest of the Mississauga and Brampton. You can see that when a young person has to go to school in Caledon and they live in Mississauga, they're getting up at 4:30 in the morning and navigating systems. So the more rural you get, I think that the issues do become complex around the most vulnerable needs to be in all in one place and close to the resources.
Excellent. Okay, no, that's, yeah, I've heard many a tale from a lot of my peers of having to get up at 5 a.m. to come into Toronto, and it is going back to that 5-kilometer story, that going back and forth, and that distance is the obstacle. And going back to the community building, as you mentioned, Dr. Mirando, it is building that diverse community that has all these resources, that has all these services that are needed to improve health outcomes, to improve economic outcomes, to improve every facet of life. And so I would like to ask, just in regards to going a bit in a different direction, and you'll notice as a moderator I tend to jump around, but recently it was announced $8.8 billion from the federal government to the government of Ontario to cut housing fees down for developers, to try to build up a better supply, even though we've been talking about demand and improving demand. And doing the research for these questions and figuring out all the various angles that could be taken here. One of the things I kind of stumbled upon, and I was very surprised about, is the construction industry being one of the largest emitters for greenhouse gases for that. So I'm just curious as to how can Canada's climate strategy more directly address how we build? How can we make sure we build housing that is sustainable, that is green? I see a smile, Dr. Weitzman. If I may ask, what are your thoughts?
I'm smiling because there was a fabulous report on this written about a year and a half, or published about a year and a half ago, called More and Better Housing, that was chaired by Don Iveson, former mayor of mayor of Edmonton, pardon me, and Lisa Raitt, a former Ontario cabinet minister, a kind of liberal and a definite conservative. And Mark Carney was on the advisory committee. And as I often think, it would be so great if private citizen Mark Carney had a chat with Prime Minister Mark Carney sometime, because it was such a great, it really brought together environmental sustainability and affordability in an exciting way. Look, I think that the current government is doing a lot of the right things. It's talking about non-market housing on government land, which is something that many of us have been talking about as a feature of successful housing policy around the world. It's talking about conditional funding, so not just throwing money at the Ontario government. I share some concerns.
Targeted funding.
Well, for conditions.
Yeah.
You know, the national housing strategy should have targets. Money should go to provinces and territories and municipalities and regions in return for annual reporting on how they're meeting the targets. The targets shouldn't just be aggregate supply. They should be, are you working towards ending homelessness? Are you working towards ending low-income housing need? You know, these are things that, again, you know, the OECD measures in a fairly consistent way. You know, it's not rocket science. So I love the idea of infrastructure transfers. I think it's unfair to expect municipalities to pay for infrastructure with 10 cents on the tax dollar, but in return, the federal government needs to show leadership in terms of, here's what we know works in order to end homelessness. We know what works to end homelessness. We've known that since At Home Chez Soi, which was actually a huge pilot project that was supported by Prime Minister Harper 15 years ago. Canada has such a history of doing really successful pilot projects, St. Lawrence Neighborhood, Housing First, and then discovering that it works and never ever doing it again.
I have to do a very quick aside here, if I may as well. UBI is the one for me, the UBI, Universal Basic Income Project.
Well, again, I'll point to the natural experiment. Housing need went down by 250,000 households in 2021. We were doing a census that year. It sprung back up in 2022 because of, the end of CERB, but there was a Canada Housing Survey in 2022. You couldn't get much more of a convincing natural experiment there, and yet we ignored it. So yeah, we have, you're a public policy crowd. If you have one lesson to learn, if you do a really successful pilot project, and of course there was a really, looked like it was going to be a successful pilot project in Ontario, on UBI. You do a big pilot project, it works, scale it up. So we're not very good at doing that in Canada, and now I completely forget your question. Oh yeah, I mean, is it possible to do environmentally sustainable, affordable housing? Hell yes, but we aren't showing the political will to do it.
Right. Dr. Miranda, I have to ask Dr. Miranda, will this be the case study on the exam on the 16th?
Yeah, so...
This will be?
No, don't worry about that.
Phew.
James is in my class that I teach, so he's looking for clues as to what our final exam is.
Trying to fish.
And we did give the UBI a case study as an example of something to look at. But on your point around development charges, and then I can get to the sustainability question.
Please.
In my preamble or in my framing, I talked about the need to give corporate Canada a kick in the pants, which I very much believe, particularly in those sectors where we don't have enough competition, like banking, like telcos, like grocery. I will say, however, I will qualify that comment by saying when it comes to the home building sector, I think we are a little too hard on those folks. And the fact that Prime Minister Carney and Premier Ford have made the moves they've made to reduce development charges, I think that's a good thing. Similarly, I think their moves to remove HST on new homes is a good thing. I think home builders do something really great in this province and in this country. They create really good jobs. They create really good local jobs. They work with suppliers from across the supply chain, and they give folks, in many cases, their dream. Home ownership or a roof over their head if they happen to be a renter. So I'm happy over the last year or so that there's been a bit of a pivot away from demonizing the home building sector and a greater recognition that they are part of the solution, not part of the problem. And I would make a similar point on sustainability. I've sat across the table from a lot of folks in the home building sector, and they're good people. They want to do the right thing. They are not automatically less interested or more interested in solving the climate crisis than any other member of the public. And frankly, they want to find more efficient ways to build. They want to cut down on their energy costs and the costs of gas or whatever it is that they're using as an input into their construction process. So I think there's goodwill on that side of the table. I think they do want to make the sector more sustainable. I think there are more and more technologies, to my earlier point, that make that easier for them and more available to them. So I think the construction sector is in a good place right now, particularly given the level of cooperation we're seeing between the sector and governments to make some big moves in this space.
Excellent. Ms. Upshaw, if I may ask.
Well, this isn't my wheelhouse, but I'll just say in Peel, I think a lot of I think the old stock that folks are living in, houses are old, they're not very efficient, and they need to invest in retrofitting those houses so they don't cost the renter a lot of money in utilities and things like that. I think the newer builds, I think that's sustainable, and I think that it's important that the climate crisis and the housing crisis works together, but that's what we're seeing in Peel, a lot of potential for older homes, but they need a lot of retrofitting to be sustainable.
Okay, excellent. And I'm just being very cognizant of the time here. We have about 5 minutes before the panel ends, and then we go into Q&A. I just would like to open up the floor to last thoughts, comments, concerns, hopes. I mean, this seems to be a very optimistic panel, which I really like. It's very different from some of the panels I've previously moderated. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. But yeah, I'll start with you, Ms. Upshaw. Yeah, please.
Optimistic, okay. I'll keep it positive. I think that there's a lot of great work being done throughout Canada. I think, as we all know, that there's a massive affordability crisis happening across municipalities. I think the biggest thing is that the federal, provincial, and municipalities have to work together. I think we have folks that are in systems that are all over the place. We have child welfare, as I mentioned, income, health. Different systems are governed by different people, and I think if we work and put the client or youth or the person that needs housing in the forefront, I think all of that stuff can be dealt with in the back end. I think we just really need to think of how we can ensure that folks get housed with the proper housing and the proper supports around them within the community, so they're not stigmatized. And NIMBYism, unfortunately, is real. But I think if folks are scattered within the community, I think it's better for them in their future.
Excellent. Doctor.
Me.
You.
Well, I mean, I see an old friend in the audience, Crystal Legacy, who does research in Australia, where I lived for a long time, on democratic participation. I do find it gobstopping. There was about 2 years, I wasn't in Canada at the time yet, but there was about 2 years where we were talking about the first national housing strategy. We need a new national housing strategy. I can't imagine it happening later than the fall budget. So let's say September, maybe November, and I haven't heard a whisper about it yet. And I do have, I mean, I'm going to publicize my own work, of course. I have a report that's going to be launched on April 14th online. If you Google my name and National Housing Strategy, you should get there. I did it for the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, which was set up by the National Housing Strategy Act. We've talked about that a couple of times. It was set up after the first National Housing Strategy, which was a bit weird, but anyhow, it's there now. To me, and I've done a lot of work on this sort of big picture stuff, we need some simple targets. I think we could end homelessness in Canada by 2040. I think we could end low-income renter housing need by about 2050, and I think we could have a decent, affordable home for every Canadian by 2060. And if we have those targets, and if we have mechanisms that we know work towards those targets, and if we have agreements with municipalities and regions and provinces and territories that provide housing-related infrastructure and housing funding in return for reporting on progress towards those targets, and doing what, like, as I gave a long laundry list earlier of what provinces should be doing and aren't around social assistance and tenant protection and health and social services for those who need it. And municipalities need to make approvals and zoning and building codes much, much easier in order to get the kind of housing that we need. So, you know, again, I don't want to say it's, well, I will say it's simple, and yet it's very complicated because of politics. But there are countries, and again, France has 3 levels of government, Finland has 2 levels of government, but those are examples. Like Finland said in, 2008, I'll take that as a significant time, we're going to end homelessness through a housing first approach. It's virtually ended. Certainly street homelessness, there's still some doubling up, which they count. France said, we are going to have a lot more affordable housing, and now in France, 15%, which is still too much, of low-income renters pay unaffordable housing and have problems feeding and getting possibly health care. They have a better health care system in France, I think. But in Canada, it's 55%. So what you need is targets. I'm talking about rich countries, smart countries that can do it. And I encourage all of you to get in touch with your local federal representative and say, hey, what's going on with the next national housing strategy?
Excellent. And Dr. Miranda.
Yeah, I think those are great points, and I'll build on both of them. So around targets, it strikes me that on housing policy and in a lot of other areas of public policy, we talk a lot about means. Supply. Supply is a means. It's not an end. And we miss sometimes the conversation around what is the end target? What is the end goal of this policy? And it's dignity. It's belonging. It's working towards a just society. Thank you, Mr. Axworthy. And this is a language and a way of thinking that I actually think has escaped our current political moment. We kind of pivot between technocratic language and thinking in public policy and sloganeering, But I think there's a big space for that more value-based approach to public policy, and we need to be explicit about that. And I think that gets to your point also around democratic renewal. I think that kind of language, those kinds of ideas, is going to light a spark in people, and it's going to mobilize them to talk to their elected representatives about the renewal of the National Housing Strategy, or about the renewal of so many other parts of our economy and public service that need to be renewed. Healthcare, education, again, ensuring that workers get their fair share of growth. And I think what we've learned over the last few years in North America and globally is that if you don't have healthy democracy, everything is put at risk. Your public services are put at risk, your economy is put at risk, the economy of your neighbors and trading partners is put at risk. So I think democratic renewal is a really, really important plank in the renewal of our public services, including but not limited to housing.
Excellent. That's a great place to end on. So we have about 18 minutes for questions and comments. I would like to open up the floor. Would you like to come on, Arvind? Oh, perfect. Here, I'll hand you mine.
There's one over there. Or there's a guy pointing.
I would have given you mine. 100%. Okay. Oh, yes. I see you in the corner, Monty. You have a question. Yeah, please do.
Monty McMurchie, who has spent close to 40 years in post-conflict development assistance. So this area, I do not consider myself to be conversant. I'm going to take my segue from Dylan Mirando, because it's all grounded in civics. And for me, the policy in terms of housing, health, and food, there's an intersectionality. It is fundamental. And it's a sense of culture, a sense of ethos. And if I may make a suggestion, reread Robert Moses, The Power Broker by Robert Caro, who distills with elegance in terms of how bias can adversely affect the construct of a city's civic social structure. And the comments that are being made are fundamental. This is a wicked problem, defying easy, ready-made solutions. And for the politician to suggest that would be misleading or misconstruing the essence. And if I were to pose a question, how could one embark in terms of the citizen to stimulate our political leadership class at the local level, at the provincial level, and the federal level to consider these issues? These are long-term. They defy short-term transactional, because a statesman in Canada, election and to be re-elected, based on a book that just came out recently. And how can you break this conundrum? And I appreciate the comments, and I thank you very much.
No, excellent, amazing question. Please, Dr. Miranda.
It's a great question. In short, I think you need to demand more of your politicians. You need to ask more of your politicians. But to some extent, as citizens, we need to demand more and expect more of ourselves, because I think we put ourselves in these political boxes. I'm blue, I'm red, I'm orange, and we stay there. And as a result, politicians can take us for granted. But if we are more complex in our own thinking about public policy, and we broadcast that complexity to politicians, and it becomes clear to leaders of every political party at every level of government that you cannot take me as a citizen for granted, because I'm a pretty sophisticated thinker about this, and my demands are going to be different in this political cycle than they were in the last political cycle. I think that's going to force politicians, their staff, the civil service to lean in a bit more and appreciate that complexity and appreciate the need to be responsive on an ongoing basis to what citizens are asking for. Apathy is what enables, apathy among the citizenry is what enables politicians to lack creativity. And so I think this is a two-way street. Politicians need to do more, we need to expect more of them, but we as citizens need to articulate those expectations loudly and consistently.
Excellent. Would anyone else like to jump in?
Yeah, I have a couple of things to say, and very much supportive of what Dylan says. Housing is infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't fit very well with political timelines, particularly when it involves an intergovernmental agreement, and there's 2 levels of government or 3 levels of government, all of whom may have different politics, as in the case of Toronto. So I was part of a discussion yesterday that was talking about infrastructure, housing, and immigration. And the long and the short of it is, it needs to be a somewhat hands-off decision. And part of the reason why I say end homelessness by 2040 or end low-income housing need by 2050 is we have to get beyond this is what we're going to do over the next 3 years, or this is what we're going to do over the next 5 years. I'm now going to say something very sympathetic about developers. Whether you're a market developer, a non-market developer, you need certainty. You need as little risk as possible. And the best way to do that, the reason why we were able to build 14% of housing as non-market housing was on the back of 40-year mortgages at 4%. And, you know, without those kinds of long-term infrastructure timelines, you're just not able to scale up the kind of housing that you need. So I don't know when infrastructure became political, and I don't know when data became political, but it sure did over the last few years. And, you know, that's a huge break on the kind of long-term thinking that we need. And I don't want to get too nostalgic about the 50s and 60s, but there was a pretty straightforward understanding of infrastructure. It's not like people went, we're going to build the St. Lawrence Seaway in 3 years, and if we don't, we're going to give that up and build something else. I mean, that's nonsense.
I was just,
Please, yeah.
excuse me, I was just going to add in, I agree, taxpayers have to advocate to their politicians, federally, provincially, municipality. I think from my lens, the amount of money that's going into the homelessness sector is unbelievable. As you house people, the return on investment is better. And I think that if I'm part of the Metamorphosis Network, and we talk about, it's about 100 nonprofits that work together and talk about the underfunding in the region of Peel. And I know everyone's underfunded, but the region is just even more special and underfunded in a variety of different places, housing being one of them. And what we're trying to do as a nonprofit sector, we get it, we understand it, we live it. What we are really trying to work towards is educating the taxpayer. Taxpayers' dollars are going into supporting the nonprofit sector that the provincial and the federal government should be funding. And we speak to the MPs and the MPPs, and that seems to be getting us slowly somewhere. When their constituents are unhappy, they will go to the MPPs and talk a bit about that. But I do think, as I said before, housing 117 youth in the shelter sector is an enormous amount of money. And if you think about housing, folks, it's a better return on investment.
Excellent. Thank you. I would like to also be cognizant of people online as well. We have a few people watching in on YouTube. Any questions from online? I don't seem to see any. Oh no, I'm getting the hand signal that there's none. But yeah, I would. Mr. Axworthy, you seem to have a question.
Yeah, Tom Axworthy, Massey College. Carolyn made the point about pilot projects, and she didn't understand why we had so many good ones and then they're not scaled up. I want to give a quick answer and then parlay it into a question. That usually happens when there's a minister or a group who want to show sympathy, who want to show that they know there's a real issue there, but they haven't persuaded the Treasury to fund a program. So you show your bona fides, but you don't have a consensus across the government to carry the big battalions. And I made some reference to the past, just illustratively, when I was active in government with Mr. Trudeau at the time that Medicare came in, and then the GIS and the child tax credit. The orientation then was heavily on the social side of the dimension, and that's when defense began to be reduced. And defense and military advocates ever since, for a generation, have lambasted governments in Canada for free rides and so on, because there was a choice. The Treasury couldn't do both, or they didn't want to anyway. So therefore, there was no question there was a shift in priority within the government and within the country. Now, today, making it relevant again, we're back to an era where, for a variety of reasons, Mr. Trump, a whole bunch of other things, defense has reemerged after a generation. Everything else is going to be that more difficult and is going to be squeezed. So my question to the panel is, what needs to be done, given this context, to persuade our Treasury and those powers that be that a universal income on the one hand, because we know from CERB it works, and the kinds of investments that we used to make in the co-op sector and so on, that was also part of the Just Society program, has to be restored. i.e., how can the case be made so we can bring the Treasury over on the housing issue going forward?
So just to reiterate the question for our viewers at home, it is how can we persuade the Canadian Treasury and those in it to make housing a priority? And I would like to, if I may actually make a very quick comment, just in regards to the defense spending angle as well. It's, at least in my mind and my conception, so intertwined to have both be met and to have that help build a stronger society. But that's just my thoughts. Dr. Wussman, yeah, please, you were leaning in, ready.
Yeah, no, I'm leaning in. You're absolutely spot on, Mr. Axworthy. So, you know, a Minister of Housing is, frankly, fairly powerless. The Minister of Finance is all-powerful next to the Prime Minister. And again, I have a son in the Navy who wants to be piloting a submarine that isn't 40 years old, so I feel his pain. But I'll say I'd say the taxation rates are a big part of it, and we know that we don't have the kind of you know, taxing the wealthy aspect that could help fund both. I'm a very yes and kind of person. I would also say that in some cases, defense spending and housing spending can be thought of together, because you haven't seen crappy houses until you've seen defense houses, but that's another story. I think that the answer is in all of the thousands of research papers that point out exactly what Christy did. I mean, the most recent, the stuff coming out of Dunhouse in Toronto, it is 3 times as expensive to house someone in the shelter system than it is to provide someone with a rent-free apartment. It's about, it's much more expensive to, well, I'm putting house and accommodate someone in a shelter or transitional housing as compared to housing with tons and tons of supports. Like, you know, 1 support worker for 10 tenants, that's really high support, you know? It's still cheaper than shelters. It's so much cheaper than emergency rooms. And in Dunhouse, there were some former residents who were going to emergency rooms 140 times a year. And it's so much less expensive than the current shuffle between encampment, tearing down a person's belongings, finding a new encampment, tearing down someone's belongings, and again, a total pipeline between jail and homelessness. So these are all things that we know are incredibly costly, and yet we're still wasting money on that instead of providing people with homes with supports.
Nice. Yeah, please, Dr. Miranda.
I'll go back to a point I made earlier, which, again, everyone in the room knows, but I think because of exhaustion and because we're demoralized, we don't say it as much as we did a few months ago. We are in the fight of our lives. And it's a 2-front war. One front is what Prime Minister Carney is doing in Ottawa, trade deals, pipelines, defense spending. Great, we need that. But the other front, in my view, the more important front, happens at places like Queen's Park. And it's the investments we're making in people, it's the investments we're making in public services, it's the investments we're making to grow our middle class. If I'm going to go to, pardon the metaphor, but if I'm going to go to war with Donald Trump, economic war with Donald Trump or some other globally competitive economy, the thing I want more than anything is a big, hungry, highly skilled workforce. That is the thing that is going to make or break our economy. And if we're not investing in healthcare, if we're not investing in education, if we're not investing in housing, if we're not making sure that the bargain between workers and their employers is protected and that workers are getting their fair share of economic growth, we are not going to have the hungriest, most highly skilled workforce. So I think investments in so-called social policy are actually the best kind of investments in economic policy. This notion that the economic horse has to come before the social cart, and that investments in our public services are somehow a luxury when you have surpluses or the economy is booming, it's completely wrong. It's completely backward. You grow your economy by investing in your social and economic infrastructure, by investing in your people. And there was a time when we knew that as Canadians. But right now, again, that narrative is lost, and that sense of social policy and the non-binary relationship between social policy and economic policy needs to be renewed in this country.
Excellent. We have time for one more question. Oh, two more questions. I'll split the time between the two of you. So I may ask if we can keep our responses very, very concise.
Sorry, I guess the question I would have is, the governments can have maybe 3 good priorities that they're going to really get done, and they're usually tied to some version of expectation. What can get the public back in? This looks like a big mess to everybody out there. It looks hopeless. Big numbers make it scary. What could make people believe that housing is going to make sense in the future, and why would they make it one of their top 3 expectations of government? I mean, in the community level, you get a lot of support. You get people reading your stuff academically. You made some arguments in government, but what could bring sufficient public interest, and a number of people talked about hopefulness, back on side here? Because right now, just people, it's lived disappointment. $60,000 to keep somebody in a hostel when we're giving people, $300 to live on for their, I mean, there's no correlation. The logic isn't what's here, it's what will move people. I just wonder if, reaching into your own experience, if you could help us with that.
I could
Please, yeah.
start off. I don't think I have anything too interesting, but I think communities really know what the communities need. And I think one of the areas that the federal government and the provincial government, even municipalities, but more federal and provincial, is they have these housing strategies, and they're working towards ending homelessness, but communities are very, very different, right? So if you're living in the region of Peel, we have our 3 communities, Caledon, Mississauga, and Brampton, as I mentioned. Those 3 communities alone are very different in what they need. We have the highest diverse population. So I think we need to switch the conversation and have the people that are in need of housing and the communities at making those decisions and speaking to the all levels of government. And working together, not in silos. As a nonprofit sector, we're vying for funding. I mean, we've talked about after COVID, it's getting worse. Tariffs, it's getting worse. We're all not working together, we're working siloed. So I think there's a lot of ability to bring folks together and communities together to understand what the issues are as it affects their own communities.
Excellent.
Well, I read David Coletto pretty regularly, and mission accomplished. Housing is one of the top 3 issues that comes up again and again. I think what's missing is a sense of we have a plan, and it's a long-term plan. The GST announcement and the development charge announcement is not a plan, and it's not a substitute for a plan. It does have a certain scent of throwing something at a wall, I'll be honest. Even if you took off, and I'm being really optimistic here, $300,000 off $1 million home, it still wouldn't be affordable to the average young person, particularly with the need for a down payment.
I can confirm that.
To build a life in, have a family in. So, what we need is a plan to bring affordable homes, not necessarily home ownership homes. I grew up in rental. I was happy in rental. I was middle class in rental. Anyhow, what we need is demonstration that we know how to create affordable homes, and that's what we're missing right now.
Excellent. And if you want to have the final word.
Well, hopefully not the final
Not the final word. No. We've got one more question.
Given that I built most of my career in the political trenches and advised politicians on questions of the sort, I'm thinking about this from that point of view. And what I would say to a politician who wants to mobilize the public in support of a particular set of policy objectives is don't underestimate the public's capacity for compassion and solidarity and wanting to have the back of their neighbor. I think there's a weird cause and effect thing happening in our political culture here where a lot of political leaders are assuming that the citizenry is self-interested, and therefore they're putting in the window a fundamentally self-interested, you're in it for yourself narrative and a set of policies that reflects that. And then citizens start to believe that about themselves because politicians aren't speaking to the better angels of the citizenry. But if we can find a way to not underestimate, again, the sense of compassion and solidarity that exists across the country from coast to coast to coast, and if we can have the courage as a political community to introduce policies that reflect that sense of solidarity, then I think we're going to see communities and provinces and individuals get behind that. So it requires a little bit of political leadership. As I said before, we need to demand more of ourselves as citizens, but we have to demand more of ourselves as a political community as well. And I think the political community has failed to speak to the better angels of Canadians.
Excellent. And if I may, the final question.
It's not really a question. So there's a statistics like there were 7.6 million old age group in 2023 and 120,000 people left Canada in 2025. The youth unemployment reached up to 14.6% in September 2025, and there's over 25,000 units that are unsold in Toronto in 2025. So I guess it's more of a comment, like, is it attributed to misplaced priorities, or is it, do we need more condos, or do we need to reuse existing housing? Like, I think it's the narrative, like how much of the data, real data and on-ground reality is being used while making these policies, as opposed to more of just jargons.
Condos are being sold for a price that isn't, well, condos aren't being sold. Condos are available for a price that isn't affordable, and there is nothing for a price that is affordable. So if you have never seen market failure before, welcome to market failure.
Excellent. Any final thoughts? Excellent. Perfect. And
These priorities also in the context of, like, we do have money to build a spa in the context of economic development, but I don't see how is it helpful to, like, just regular middle class people.
Okay, and I think on that note, we will end the panel. Thank you so much for coming out and chatting. And we'll take about 10, 6-ish minutes. You're the boss, Arvind.
We'll take approximately 5 minutes to reset.
5 minutes. Oh God.
And very huge thank you to our panelists. We explored some very important critical themes, cross collaboration among sectors, perhaps improving effectiveness in the public sector is one approach that was mentioned as well. So these are some very excellent themes that we hope to engage with throughout the remainder of today. So please enjoy a washroom break, a stretch break, and we'll be back in exactly 5 minutes. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you.